My name's Desmond Lochman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon's discussion on bad transitions in Central Europe and the European Union. And it is truly a great honor and privilege for me to introduce someone as distinguished, both as a policymaker and as a scholar, as Professor Balcerowicz. With his international reputation, he hardly needs an introduction. But suffice it for me to say that with the fall of communism in Poland in the early 90s, both as Deputy Prime Minister and as Minister of Finance, Professor Balcerowicz is deservedly credited with the economic miracle that has occurred in Poland. He's also served as chairman of the National Bank of Poland, and he's remained a major voice of reason in both the Polish and the European economic scene. In that context, he's been the founder of the Civil Development Forum, a non-government think tank based in Poland, promoting and defending economic freedom, the rule of law, individual liberties, entrepreneurial activities, and ideas of limited government. It would seem to me that we could not have chosen a more opportune time to hear Professor Balcerowicz's views on Central Europe and the European Union, where there would appear to be no shortage of issues to discuss. In addition to Hungary and Poland openly challenging now European democratic values, we have the United Kingdom readying itself to exit the European Union, a populist Italian government appearing to be on a collision course with the European Economic Commission over the budget, and now there seem to be major political changes occurring in both Germany and France. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Professor Balcerowicz's views on the state of the Central European and the European political economy. How we're arranging this is that he'll speak for around about half an hour, and that'll be followed by a short conversation between Professor Balcerowicz and myself, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Balcerowicz to the podium.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for this generous introduction. In my professional life, I've been dealing with monetary and fiscal problems, but first of all, with institutions. Reforms are about institutions. Transitions, mere shifts from one institutional system to another one. So let me start with a bit more general presentation. Is it working? Where it is working? Where? I can see that. Once again. Yes, I am pushing the green. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. This is the plan, ambitious plan. I try to keep to the time constraint, and I would like to show you, as for a start, once again. Okay, I don't know whether you can read it. I hope that you can. I think there are 5 main dimensions which characterize institutional systems that are listed, and they are interdependent. As you know, the democracy has 100 different definitions, but the simplest one proposed by Schumpeter is that it's open political competition as expressed in regular free elections. If you don't have this, you need another mechanism, for example, dynasty, like in North Korea, or one-party state, when the chief of the party becomes the chief of the country, or military commander, or coup d'etat. Now, to have open political competition, you need civil rights, which also serve for other purposes, for self-organization, for good or bad, depends on the direction, and rule of law, which have 100 definitions but the essence is clear. Rule of law exists whenever the rulers act not through secret police, but a role which respects at least the due process, not only on paper, but in practice, which means independent justice system. Otherwise, you have dictatorship. So independent police, independent prosecution, independent judges, of course. And finally, that's it. Economic freedom is fundamental, but always attacked. Economic freedom exists, as you know, if there is free entrepreneurship, private ownership, which is well enforced and protected. Now, depending on and finally, fiscal stance, I only mentioned, it reflects the role of the welfare state in society. And there is a myth that there is no welfare state in the United States. I show you how the United States fares against some European countries. Okay, now very briefly, based on these 5 or 4 variables, you can distinguish several different types of institutional systems. What was socialism? Or communism, if you don't like if you love the word socialism. It started with destruction of economic freedom, or in other words, replacement with monopoly of state ownership and central planning, destruction of the market, and this was sufficient for all other freedoms to be eliminated. So democratic socialist is like vegetarian hyena. Because why? Because once you introduce total monopoly in the hands of the state, you can use it as a tool of repression or rewards. State ownership gives you this instrument. And besides, such system can perform in the longer run only badly. So you have to repress the resentment, and you need KGB. No socialist without secret police. So it cannot coexist with civil rights, rule of law, and not to mention democracy. So this is, and we have in various countries which try a quasi-socialist, like Belarus under Lukashenko, but also many Arab countries. And their poor economic performance is often blamed on Islam, while it should be blamed on socialism or quasi-socialism. And finally, let me mention that what we call capitalists have different variants. And I think the best one, which is free market, rule of law capitalist, is the most attacked for some strange reasons. Why there are some much worse systems, oligarchic, when you have private ownership, but very unevenly protected. So if you happen to be a cousin or colleague of the ruler, you may expropriate other entrepreneurs using state apparatus, tax administration, prosecution, etc., like in Russia. We've got a great expert on that, Anders. How is doing that? And most of European systems fall into, I think, into the category of overregulated or fiscally unstable, including Italy, which was mentioned. But at least in most, if not all of them, there is a respect for the rule of law, which is fundamental for the quality of life, both economic and non-economic. And after this brief introduction, let me say that there are what was a good transition? After collapse of socialism, a transition towards liberty within the rule of law. And I am going to show you certain data on that. Bad transition, by definition, moves you from a good position towards worse position on these dimensions, especially rule of law, civil liberties, and in most cases, also economic liberty. Okay, now very briefly, I skip that. This only symbolizes that there's a lot of, it's a massive empirical research which links differences in institutional systems or changes to differences in the dimensions of quality of life. It is not only the level of per capita income, which is very important, but the extent of fear. Countries which perform economically badly use a lot of fear rather the rulers. Otherwise, they cannot keep power. And also differences in other dimensions. If you eliminate the position of entrepreneurs, you waste a lot of human capital, because a section of every population has certain dispositions to work on their own, and they cannot use their talents. But I wanted only to tell you that what about the welfare state in various countries? On this, you can see this axis, you have the percentage of social transfers as a percentage of GDP. And then on this axis, you would have per capita income, and you see huge differentiation. So there is no Wagner law, meaning that the higher is your per capita income, the more you spend. Huge differentiation. And it's not true that there's no welfare state in the US. US spends more than Switzerland, Canada, and Australia as a percentage of GDP. So just to make this point. Now, very briefly, what has happened after the collapse of socialism or Soviet bloc, which was huge and pleasant surprise. Probably nobody expected that this would happen. I did not expect this even at the beginning of '89, even though as a hobby I worked on reforms. Initially, it seemed that all the countries of the former Soviet bloc were moving in the same direction of market economy, democracy, civil rights, rule of law. But pretty quickly, the trajectories have differentiated, and I am showing you differences as measured now by various indices. So, for example, on the freedom of the press, clearly you have dictatorships like in Belarus or Russia when it is being suppressed, similar to Cuba or China, and countries were moved in the Western direction, at least until recently. The same goes for rule of law. Huge differentiation. Once again, what's that? Civil liberties. Protection of property rights as a proxy for differences in the extent of economic freedom. Huge differentiation, so various transitions. Private sector share increase everywhere, but unevenly. But this does not measure a very important dimension, differences in the protection of property rights. Rule of law assumes equal protection of rights. Oligarchic capitalism means you have very uneven protection. And this is overlooked and very, very important difference. Trade openness. Most countries opened very much from one-sided dependence on the Soviet bloc to the West, which was economically only normal. But the dependence on exports of raw materials differs, and Russia is very dependent on exports of oil and gas. And finally, these measures presented differences in institutional changes, both economic and non-economic, and I would show you very briefly differences in economic and non-economic outcomes, which can be related empirically, and they are related empirically to the changes in institutional systems. So that GDP grows very unevenly. I am very proud that Poland so far has been one of the leaders. Ukraine is catching up, and probably this does not include all the improvement in Ukraine, but you see striking differences. Now, some people say, well, economic growth is okay, but it may be achieved at the cost of some social indicators. Generally, it is not true, but certainly it's not true in the case of Poland, because you can see that in terms of Human Development Index, students, inequality of income, and some other indexes. Poland's improvements have been as large or even larger than on the GDP growth. Now, the main observations. First, democracy has been achieved and maintained only in the countries which moved from socialist to capitalism. And it cannot be otherwise. You can't have democratic socialism. And this is underestimated when state ownership is being analyzed. This is very bad in terms of efficiency. It's very bad in terms of politics. This is underestimated. This is overlooked. And this is a fundamental direction. Now we have some non-democratic systems. Some of them are quasi-socialist, like in Belarus. Some of them are quasi-capitalistic, oligarchic capitalists, like in Russia or Kazakhstan. Very briefly. Now I am moving to, I understand, the main topic, at least the main announced topic. But let me start with brief analytical framework, because I think it is dangerous to just focus on descriptions. I call bad transition, bad political transition, all the cases when you have a lowering of the measures of civil rights or rule of law. And as a consequence, a growing danger to democracy. This is the definition. So not everything is bad transition according to this definition. Perhaps Italy is not yet a bad transition. We'll see. This is much more, and based on this definition, I would distinguish three cases. The first one, bad transition has been already completed, which means free elections are impossible. There are elections, but everybody knows who is going to win because of the capture of the state, especially of the repressive apparatus, and a completed transition. Bad transition, as you see, includes Russia under Putin, Belarus under Lukashenko, Venezuela under Chavez, and some people say Hungary and Orban. A great Hungarian economist, János Kornai, is of this opinion. So the change would have to come from within the black box of dictatorship. We cannot remove bad transition democratically. The second case, democratically reversed bad transition, and this is very interesting, even though limited category. It's worth watching. So far, I've put in Macedonia in this category, because the ruler of Macedonia, who just is seeking refuge in Budapest, certainly tried to complete a bad transition, but he failed. And the third point is incomplete bad transition. So the results are, or final results are open. I would count Poland in this category, and on Poland I am going to say a little more. So now it's a lot of, I would say, speculation or literature on bad transition. Most of it suffers from not very clear definitions. And also, it's a mix-up of two questions which should be kept separate. The first one, the reasons for the start of bad transition, the reasons. And the second, what happens next, and how long it is going to last. Two different questions. They are related empirically, but they are different. Now, on the first question, I would say that, you have accidents on the roads. You have shocks in the economy. You have accidents in politics, too. Meaning that something which happens not because of purely systematic factors, but unexpected factors, which did not need to happen, but happened. And I give you two examples in the Polish case, to which I will return happened under very good economic situation, but for some other reasons which I'm going to return to. In Hungary, situation was not so good, economic situation was not so good. There were some previous scandals with respect to the previous governments which are amplified, etc., etc. But you have a chance factors. This not undermine the legitimacy of the victors, but contradicts popular theories that there are massive shifts in every society in the direction of populism. And populism is usually not defined. So everybody can be populist. Now, once people who want to try to reduce the level of civil rights, rule of law, win elections, and they want to entrench themselves in power, they have three instruments. The fourth one would be falsifying elections. But if they do not falsify, they have three instruments. The first one is clientelism, or bribing, if you will, by distributing goods, both from the budget and jobs, massively. The second one is propaganda, which includes trying to reduce the freedom of the media and to turn them into tools of party propaganda. And the third one, and this is the ultimate one, if it is developed, is intimidation. And remember that in the worst cases, intimidation works, even in the sense that even if an economic situation is very bad, like in Venezuela or under socialism, people do not revolt for a very long time. Why? Because they are intimidated. Ultimately, they know that it would be too dangerous. So one has to watch, especially this final third tool. And there is no elimination of democracy in the sense of political competition without capturing the state. You capture the state institutions, starting with the repressive apparatus, like police, secret police, or normal police. Prosecution is very dangerous if it is captured. And finally, the courts. But tax administration can be the tool of intimidation. Every agency, inspections can be. So a common denominator is capturing institutions which for their normal functioning would have to be kept separate and independent. And this capturing can happen in two ways. First, changing the laws so that the competences are very much reduced. The name remains, competences are eliminated. And the second, nothing changes. Only the new rulers are infiltrating the institutions by sending their own people, who are their agents. So they are faithful either to the creed or for some other reasons. So they act against the mission of the institution, being the Supreme Court or Constitutional Tribunal or prosecution. So personal infiltration. This is often underestimated in political science literature, but that matters. In cases of bad transition. Now, if you discuss the dynamics, remember what is the dangerous combination in history? Bad guys who have good luck. And you can plan for it. It happens. And what is this? Behind this combination is a good economic situation, which is not the result of economic policies, but for other factors. But in every society, many people think that if their economic situation is good, the government is good. So that you have to rely more on communication. Now, the final section. Let me mention also that in the recent bad transition, you do not have rulers which capture the state in order to introduce more economic freedom. So not Pinochet type. Now, all these cases include reduction in economic freedom. So all the freedoms, to some extent, are reduced, along with the economic freedom. Now, let me say at the beginning that there are deep divisions in Poland, but there are certain common views, and one of the common views is that we are very interested across the political spectrum to have stronger NATO and stronger American presence in Poland. So there are no conflicts about this, and I want to stress this. But there are sharp differences regarding the direction of policies, especially with respect to the rule of law. As an economist, institutional economist, I care about the rule of law because it's so crucial for non-economic quality of life, but it's also very important for economic growth in the longer term. So both. I cannot overestimate the importance of the rule of law, which as I said, in practice means independent and professional institutions of the justice system. Remember that I don't know any dictatorship where justice system would be independent from the rulers. So this is the indication to watch. Now, the description of what has happened, you have some notes which list this more carefully. So if there are questions, please refer to the note. Let me say there is no institution which have not been, if not completely captured, then under attack, and recently ordinary courts. This starts to be reflected in certain measures. It's not too early to have the full impact, but something is already measured. The media, what is called the public media are the party media. And they are tools of crude, aggressive propaganda, which is a tool of aggression against the opponents. I can compare. How was it under communism? It's worse. It's even worse. Now, we have the combination of very good current economic situation because of the starting conditions and improving European economy until recently, which many people misunderstood as a sign of good economic policy, but unfortunately, this is not the case. Well, one of the promises of the new government was the policy which would increase the investment ratio, which was too low. But their policies have brought down the private investment, especially because of the simple fact, uncertainty, political risk, chaotic legislation, and chaotic implementation of bad legislation. So this is the measure how we fare. This is the indicator of unpredictability of policies. So I grant Italy is even worse, but in this respect. And Greece is even worse. But it was not like that 10 years ago. Now, current fiscal situation is pretty good, but it masks structural deficits. With this booming economy, you should have a surplus. We have a deficit, which is, as you can see, one of the largest in OECD. And what is very worrisome for everybody which understands that the state sector is usually a politicized sector is an increase in the share of the state sector. There are various pseudo-theories which try to justify or to say, well, state sector can be equally efficient as private sector, which is contrary to all experience and disregards political links between the rulers and the managers. There have been massive purge in the states, especially two largest banks are already state-owned, and we are in the third place regarding the share of the banking asset in the state hands after Belarus and Russia. Perhaps Slovenia, but they suffered a huge collapse because of the crisis in the state sector, state banking sector. So this is the list which have been posted by various observers of what has been happening in Poland during the last 3 years. Restrictions, the attacks against the rule of law and against economic freedom, with a fiscal policy which is dangerous in the bit longer run, but the dangers are masked by the current booming economy. Now, even without this 3 years of not very responsive policy, we would be facing a slowdown. And this is why my foundation, Civic Development Forum, has proposed a report 3 years ago pointing to various scenarios. In the best scenario, we said, list reforms which would be needed in order to neutralize the dangers to longer-term economic growth. One can say that what has been pursued during the last 3 years is just the opposite. No reforms and counter-reforms. So, for example, because of demography, we needed to maintain or even to increase the retirement age. It was reduced. A new massive fiscal and social scheme which rewards families with children contributes to women withdrawing from the labor market. And this is at a huge cost. Okay, I think you may have some questions about the future. So I'd best lift. Let me say that Polish society is not passive. I think we are a bit different from Hungary. And I sense a growing mobilization in an organized form. I know it because I am participating in it. I switched to social media instead of writing boring books. So I have more than 300,000 people on Twitter in Polish, and more than 90,000 followers on Facebook. Be welcome there. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for those words. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. Perhaps if I could ask you just a few questions before we go to the Q&A. Maybe we could start, if you could put Poland and Hungary's political development in a broader context, perhaps in more a European-wide context. What I'm thinking about is that political change hasn't been confined to Poland and Hungary. In fact, if you look around Europe, you do seem to see the elites very much on the defensive. Centrist parties seem to be imploding. Parties at the extremes seem to be gaining in strength. I'm thinking of places, certainly Italy would fit into that category, but France, would be another that could be mentioned. And many say that a reason that we're seeing that is rather disappointing economic performance, not necessarily in overall GDP growth, but in terms of distribution. We're getting people feeling that they're left behind, issues like immigration. And I was just wondering whether those are the kind of forces. They're certainly not in play in Poland, where economic growth has been very good. But how do you explain the political deterioration?
Well, I would first say that the picture is very mixed, and we would warn against excessive generalization, especially trying to link certain phenomenon to just one common cause. Because first of all, notice countries like Benelux, to my knowledge, like Germany, like Sweden, notwithstanding the recent political instability, like Norway, they are not in the same situation like as Poland and Hungary. And these two cases should be distinguished, I think, from Italy or France. And if you look for some common reasons behind discontent present in some countries, I would say delayed reforms, or incomplete reforms in Italy, which contribute to high structural employment among younger people. Probably in France, to some extent. It is probably not the only reason. I would not rule out some foreign encouragement for these recent radical and massive signs of discontent. So what I can say that I think one has to be much more specific in trying to explain problems in certain countries and look for the common reasons, but not generalize in the whole of Europe. Now, you mentioned emigration. So what's interesting is that countries which have not admitted any refugees, their rulers have played upon the fear of emigration. Unfortunately, this has been the case in Poland. And the official propaganda tends to equate refugees with terrorists. And they managed to raise the fear against immigration. In some countries, the opposite cases are countries which admitted a lot, like Germany or Sweden, very nobly, but probably they exceeded the certain levels of preparation. I think I just talked to others about Sweden, so admit record number of refugees without conditions which would allow them to join the labor market is the only short-term solution. So this would be the opposite cases. Generous countries which are without good preparation for being really generous. In Hungary, they admitted some 50,000. Well, I think in Hungary you have a shameless anti-refugee propaganda. It's absolutely shameless. And another one is against Soros, with anti-Semitic undertones, quite clearly, which mobilizes some people, but should be condemned from the moral point of view. I think morals should count in political discourse and assessment.
But in Hungary, if I understood you correctly, that the bad transition has really taken a turn that's going to be very difficult to reverse. Poland, you'd be a lot more optimistic about?
Well, I try to be neither pessimistic or optimistic, but active. Activist, because there are too many people who, to wait for the others, or say this is going to happen in any case without my personal contribution. So I think I would say, comparing the activism in Hungary and Poland, I would guess that it is stronger in Poland than in Hungary.
But in Poland, I guess, from the economic outlook, the way in which you were describing it, it sounds like during the good period of global economic growth, Poland was really falling behind on reforms. They weren't getting investment going. Looking ahead, it seems to me that we're now at a different stage of the global cycle, that the external environment is going to get a lot more difficult, that we're seeing the Federal Reserve, we're seeing the European Central Bank withdrawing from stimulating these economies. So this could mean that the going is going to get a little bit rougher for a place like Poland.
Oh, absolutely. As I mentioned 3 years ago, we have sketched 3 scenarios. The first one was without reforms, and then it was obvious that there's going to be a slowdown, even disregarding any shocks. But if we have some shocks in the world economy, then the slowdown would be even deeper. I am not forecasting it because it's impossible, but at least The milder version would be a gradual slowdown, and with the risk that Poland would stop catching up with the West, which has been a historical achievement. Poland was lagging behind the West until 1989 for 300 years because of difficult history. And this is a historical process in Poland. So this is the risk.
Yep. If we get a situation like appears that this is almost a certainty, is that Britain is going to leave the European Union, I would guess that Poland would be the largest European country that would be in the single market, but it wouldn't be in the euro. Is that a sustainable kind of position, and should Poland be joining the euro?
Oh, this is a very important question. Now, I don't see reasons why it would not be sustainable. I don't see economic reasons why Sweden is. Yes, it's outside the eurozone, and I don't see any dangers to Sweden. And I don't see much chance that Sweden would join euro in the foreseeable future. So I don't see any economic necessity. My position is that there are more fundamental things than monetary regime. And the more fundamental things are rule of law and economic freedom, and energy should be focused on this, on reversing the destruction of these two things. This is the first argument. The second argument is that you would have to change Poland's constitution. And it's not very realistic in the foreseeable future to have majority. And third is that economic union is very popular in Poland, perhaps superficially, but it is. 84, euro is not popular. And you can demonize euro in a very, very cleverly, saying that Greece suffered because of euro, which to some extent is true, or that prices of coffee would explode, etc. And you can really brainwash lots of people. So I am not recommending to the opposition in Poland to focus on the fast adoption of euro.
Would you think that being outside the euro served Poland well in 2008, in the sense that having the freedom to allow its currency to depreciate, that might have been part of the reason that Poland managed to weather 2008, better than many other countries that were stuck in a currency
Well,
union?
certainly it was a factor, but not the only one. I think the most important factor was that we have not suffered boom. We have not allowed boom to develop, housing boom. As a result, we have not suffered the bust. And if I would have to mention why, one of the reasons was that the central bank, which I have a pleasure of heading, never dreamt of emulating Mr. Greenspan. So we were pretty restrictive against the monetary fund. We wanted to be more restrictive than monetary fund have recommended us. And so this is one of the reasons. But in the longer run, it's not enough to say very important freedom is freedom of devaluation. There are some other important things. But if you enter the arrangement of hard packs, you have to have policies which do not stimulate the booms, which undercut competitiveness and fiscal balance should be very, and flexible wages.
Right. But might the situation be that some countries fit into the euro, whereas others don't? That, in other words, what I'm thinking about is if you've got a country like Italy, which doesn't have the ability to improve its productivity, it doesn't make sense to lock it in a currency union with a country like Germany, which does have ability. So what we see over time is that the one country continues to lose international competitiveness to another. So it's no surprise that you get different kind of economic performances. My question would be, would you have confidence that Poland would be able to compete on a long-term basis, or that it wouldn't be subject to asymmetric kind of shocks that would really require that it had more flexibility on the currency?
Well, implicitly I implied that I do not consider a quick adoption of euro as an important priority for Poland. And there are more fundamental things. First, on more general note, I think the importance of monetary regimes is hugely exaggerated compared to more important things, which are extent of freedom, protection of freedom, flexibility of markets. So if you have healthy fundamentals, you are performing well under any regime. Remember gold standard, rigid. If you have bad fundamentals, you perform badly also under any monetary regime, except it would be more dangerous for you to enter a hard pack arrangement. So, the conclusion, focus on the fundamentals. And not on the demand-side policies, as it is now fashionable. They would not replace supply-side reforms like in Italy.
Right. Let me ask you one last question before
Please.
I turn it over. How does China fit into your view of the world? You know, that China seems to have been a country that is hardly known for democratic freedoms. It really clamps down, it controls the press, it has got a lot of control of key banks, state apparatus seems rather large. Yet, for 25 years, it's really surprised everybody at the pace at which it's grown and that it's taken so many people out of poverty. You know, how does that fit in your view of the world? You know, that if I look at your schemata, you would have thought that this would be a country that wouldn't be doing.
No, because, sorry, but first of all, China is performing well not because it is a dictatorship, but because it's enormously increased the extent of economic freedoms under Deng Xiaoping, starting in the late 70s. And China was very lucky because it has a large sector, agriculture, which was hugely repressed by nonsensical communes. It was very easy to get quasi-privatized, and they did it, and they followed on that. So you do not need to get ideal economic freedom to grow. What matters is the size of the increase of economic freedom. And there was a massive increase in economic freedom. Now for the last, it is not to be taken for granted, because in the last 10 years, it is rather stagnation. So this is the first factor. So look at the increase. Now, so far, Chinese dictatorship did not include suppression of economic freedom. So they've been having better policies than Russia. Of course, the starting conditions were much more conducive than to Russia. And second difference between China and Russia is that I think they were wise enough not to start with expanding welfare state, which contribute to growth in savings, which finance lots of investment. In Russia, initial position was bloated welfare state, so Chinese managed to overinvest in infrastructure, while in Russia, infrastructure is in a very bad form, in a very bad shape. So China does not contradict the story that by far the most important factor for longer-term economic growth is extension of economic freedom. How large it is to be is an empirical question. You cannot theoretically say this, that, and that. Empirically speaking, in China, it was so far sufficient. China, impressive economic growth is so impressive because China is large. But China is repeating. Remember the rate of growth of Japan? 10% in the 50s, in the 60s. What about South Korea? What about Taiwan? China is large, and one benefit, it is large internal domestic market, which is not divided like in India into regions. In a way, China has more free markets than India.
I thought when you mentioned Japan, you might have been thinking that China might be going the way that Japan has gone, in the sense that a lot of its growth seems to have been rather artificial, in that having an enormous credit bubble, overexpansion, that a price will eventually be paid.
Yeah, absolutely right. I know, whenever I'm in the West, I am struck that many people believe that China is above economic laws. Many economists, especially macroeconomics, they say in democracy you have so many obstacles to moving quickly. In China, just one order from the top, beloved leader, and everything is done. There's such a fallacy to underestimate the danger of dictatorship. Remember, the worst catastrophes, economic and genocide, happened because of a concentration of political power. And we don't know. You are quite right. I am also looking at what's happening in the financial sector in China. I think it's absolutely certain that Chinese growth, even without any disturbance, would slow down. The labor supplies without extra reforms. So this is one of the risks for the world economy. What is going to happen to China?
Well, thank you very much. Let's throw it open to questions. Maybe if there's a microphone.
Barry Wood, Hong Kong Radio, formerly Voice of America. Mr. Balcerowicz, first of all, thank you for all you've done. I don't think as a reporter I've had any more exciting period than 1989 when at that disused at the time Polish embassy on North 16th Street, you unveiled what became the Balcerowicz plan. It's amazing that's 20, but that's where it all began. My question is this. You didn't mention culture. What about Russia? If the West had stepped forward in, say, 92 with massive funds to Russia, more than was given, would that have made a difference in their transformation?
I don't know, but I doubt. Because I wonder to what extent it would prevent the rise of Putin. Because this is the question. Would it help Democrats to be in power? If you can suggest and prove that it would have been possible, then perhaps there would be a different trajectory. But I just don't know. Hello.
Sir?
Just honesty of disclosure, I'm quite deeply rooted in Hungary. Just came back from teaching 3 weeks at the Central European University, which today is in mourning, as you probably know from the press. Prior to that, I was the founder and first chair of the Fiscal Council. Prior to that, I was a member of the Monetary Council in Hungary. And I just would like to illustrate with a few comments, and they are not really on the optimistic side at all.
Can you keep them brief?
Brief. I try to be as brief as possible on a longer story, but all the indices that we know, and you cited a few of them, global competitiveness index, the doing business in the various countries, the Freedom House and so forth, Hungary is way behind Poland, where it wasn't after the transition, when the transition began. But let me just illustrate a little bit with history, because you mentioned...
I wonder whether you could ask a question,
yeah.
if you don't mind.
Well, I don't really have a question. I mean, I can stop right there.
But maybe let somebody else ask a question.
All right.
Talk.
The gentleman over here.
You alluded, Tom Palmer from Atlas Network, you alluded to foreign influences, and I think we know who that is. And we see the fingerprints all over Europe behind all the neo-fascist and neo-communist movements. You find Kremlin cronies and money, Vladimir Yakunin and Konstantin Malofeev, and all those figures funding these. How would you differentiate, though, Poland from, say, Hungary? So Orban has been sidling up very close to the Kremlin. He wants to play both sides. That's very difficult in Poland because of the fear, traditional fear of Russia. So in the rest of Europe, we see the Kremlin very active promoting illiberal movements. But Poland seems to be in an odd position because Polish nationalists can't make alliance with the Kremlin so conveniently because of the long history. So how does that play out in terms of, will Poland still be attached to more Central European values or not?
I think there are several questions, but let me start that I was shocked when I asked my Hungarian friends, how is it possible after the experience of 1956 to have the ruler who is openly so close to Russia? Yes, you can respond. I give you the opportunity. Or let's call it a rhetorical question. And that for me it's strange, but probably our history of being under Russian rule for 150 years makes it very difficult to be openly for Putin. But perhaps some people say, I am quoting, that Putin does not need to intervene in Poland. What is the dream of Putin? Weak European Union and weak countries. So by reducing the rule of law, by reducing economic freedom, by destroying Poland's reputation in the West, this is something which perhaps exceeds Putin's dreams. I am not saying that this is on purpose. You have this impolite, I want to be diplomatic, so I'm not going to name it, but something which is contrary to official declaration, but is driven by domestic or internal purposes to get stronger hold on your own system, on your own state, and disregarding the consequences. I am not saying, I am sure that, even though I cannot prove it now, but I am sure that Putin also intervenes via the media in Poland. For example, we've been very supportive of Ukraine, and rightly so, because Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. And the previous government was very supportive. I was very supportive. Civil society was very, and all of a sudden, there have been tensions with this new government because of some difficult chapters of history, but this is not a good time. This is also not a good time because, in a way, Ukraine is fighting for Poland indirectly. It is a bastion. So geopolitics would tell you, support Ukraine, even if you don't like them. They deserve sympathy for geopolitical reasons, but it's not being done. So there's a reversal on policies with respect to Ukraine, even though the official position is very much against, no, even not very much, it's not so outspoken. That's very interesting. I realized that probably this open criticism of Russia is sometimes less than open criticism of European Union in Poland.
Anders.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the European Union. How should the European Union influence Poland in this situation? We just saw that the European Court of Justice partly reversed the Supreme Court reform. There is a discussion about applying Article 7 procedure against Poland, that is to deprive Poland of the right of vote in the European Union. And there's a discussion about depriving Poland of some structural funds, which are very substantial from the EU each year. What do you think the EU should do, or is it something else that the EU should apply in order to stop the bad reforms that you're seeing? Thank you.
Okay. To start with, European Union institutions were late in stopping Orban, including European People's Party. I think Orban party should have been expelled earlier. But for some reasons, they were tolerant, and this, of course, encouraged both Orban and other people. But having said that, let me mention what European Union has done to some extent because of pressures coming from civil society in Poland. And there are 4 instruments which were 4 years ago, nobody thought that this instrument would be activated. The first one is Chapter 7, which is the least effective, because easily politicized, Orban can block the use, etc. But it's symbolic, and I would say, given European values and declaration, European Union, for its own sake, could not stay passive. It's not for Poland's sake, for European Union's sake. The second you mentioned, Anders, was the fact that most likely what Poland will get in the next financial perspective would be less if there was more less European Union unfriendly government. You cannot measure it easily, but it's pretty certain. Third, you also mentioned something which seemed completely unlikely, the fact to make the payment of some structural or even agricultural funds dependent on the observance of the rule of law. This is almost certain. And the fourth, and this is, I think, the most effective tool, is European Court of Justice, because it's not politicized. Now, European Court of Justice has reacted towards only one part of bad transition regarding the courts, which is sending judges while violating constitution in retirement after 65, but there are two worse. First, there was an anti-constitutional change of the body which is called Judicial Council, which is very important because it nominates new judges. And this has been captured by people who should never be judges, and by politicians. And this body has nominated people to the new chamber of the Supreme Court, which is called disciplinary chamber, which can serve as a tool of intimidation of the judges. And they are trying to do that. And what is the composition of this chamber? Some prosecutors, including one which has been unmasked as a sadist, and some judges who would be never nominated under the normal regime. And this is the most dangerous thing. It's not quite sure whether the European Union, or to be more precise, the European Court of Justice will react to that. This is why the results of coming elections are so important in Poland. And the next elections are in May, European elections for European Parliament. And here I think it is a very clear dividing line. Most of Poland's population, especially urban population, is for Poland in the strong European Union. While we have the government which behaves as though the main problem was European Union. And you can imagine nasty propaganda which would increase, would reduce the support for European Union. Remember Brexit? Civilized British society? I don't remember anybody a year before the referendum which would have predicted. But the dose of rise, because I listened to this, or exaggeration, was sufficient to shift. So the coming European elections in Poland are very important in themselves, but also because then in October or November we have parliamentary elections. So if there is a clear results for pro-European and pro-democratic forces in Poland, this would give impetus to the next elections, in parliamentary elections.
Does this complicate what the European Union can do to Poland ahead of those elections?
Why? Because of European elections?
Well, I think, no, I'm just thinking that cutting off funds, for instance, to Poland, could that...
No, I think this is possible only regarding next financial perspective, not the current funds. Not the current funds.
Back then.
Thank you very much. Rachel Van Elken from the IMF. You mentioned Poland's very impressive performance in income catch-up since the beginning of transition, but it's also the case that many people have been left behind. And this is, of course, something that we've seen in many countries around the world. And it's manifested, as you mentioned, an urban-rural divide. And, we even saw on the streets in Paris, these last couple of weekends, that it's the yellow jackets from outside, from the more rural areas who are coming in and protesting against a situation that they see favors the more economically powerful. I'm wondering if in Poland, where there is a large population and probably a much higher share in rural areas, if this has contributed to the rise of the current political process in Poland. And maybe it's not as manifest in other countries in Europe.
Let me say openly, the phrase left behind is very emotive because it suggests bad intentions, first. So one should use more neutral language. Secondly, I think it is dangerous to link it just to one scenario, because you should ask a comparative question. How many people are left behind under different strategies? This is the correct question. I'm saying that because so many people link the notion of social cost of reforms only to reforms without comparing what would have happened without reforms. Compare Poland and Belarus, Poland and Ukraine, etc. So this thinking about what is the percentage of people who are left behind because of reforms is extremely dangerous. And it's not very correct, logically speaking, to be completely truthful. And you have a lot of nonsense, emotional nonsense related to the discussion about inequalities. And I tell you why. And this is, can you imagine, Piketty is called a new Marx. And this is taken as a compliment. Can you imagine? New Marx, who has proposed the most destructive regime, which unfortunately was implemented, has new incarnation, Piketty. And he's a new Marx. This is a compliment. Something is, I think, basically wrong with the thinking in the West. Among some, because first, confusion is confusing equality of opportunity and equality of income. You would tend to think that we should try to introduce zero inequality of opportunity. This is impossible because you would have to remove family. But except for family, this is clear. What about inequality of income? Zero? What is a good figure? It's impossible to determine. So you can discuss indefinitely. Second one, people are dying of poverty, not because of inequality. So the true goal is fighting poverty. And you fight poverty when you fight bad regimes. What are the bad regimes? Those who deprive people of economic freedom because of bad governments. And I think in this whole, and there are many technical errors in this Piketty book, which has been so popular that he was even received by the former president, because it's so fashionable, even though it is analytically very incorrect. Analytically, I am not attacking I am attacking the standards, criticizing the standards. So coming to your question, farmers in Poland have been most privileged. Why? Because of European Union. They derive 50% of their income from European Union, and they tend to vote for the anti-European party. So, the key is not to give them more money, but to have a good communication and to install some fear that perhaps this money may disappear, and they value concrete values very much, meaning money.
Thank you. So I'm Dora Zombri. I'm with the Embassy of Hungary. And today we heard many factors, comments also examples in the lecture that we're condemning Hungary on different grounds, mainly on political ground. Right now, it's not the time to answer like all of these condemnations. But I will be staying here and respond both the CU issue, Russian influence, or also the anti-Semitic claim that I received. And I feel truly disappointed that I came here to hear a lecture about the bad transitions, and Hungary was placed as an example of a bad transition, together with countries where people were killed, like in Erdogan's Turkey in the coup, or with Chavez. So I just wanted to let you know that I'm here and ready to discuss all the issues.
You.
My name is Sanjin Choi, Langham Partners. Thank you for being an economist with a conscience. My question is, last year, Poland issued a first non-Asian sovereign issued a panda bond. My question is it geostrategic or financial?
Pardon?
A panda.
Is it strategic or financial, the issue of an Asian bond?
Asian bond.
Panda bond.
It is not strategic because I have overlooked it.
And second, with regard to Hungary, and of course, it appeared to me Hungarians want to cement or connect to between Central Eastern Europe to China with the Belt Road Initiative. For me, it's more like geostrategic issue rather than financial issue. I would be interested in your views.
I can't speak for Hungary. It's very dangerous.
This gentleman over there.
Thank you. Krzysztof Błędowski, Maypai. I'd like to enlarge your question, Desmond, on, you mentioned China, but I'd like to go back to Taiwan and Korea, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2 generations worth of a transition from agricultural, industrial, post-industrial societies. Clearly, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative were very much dependent. In other words, the authoritarian regimes were very much in place. It would look like this was irreversible. And yet we saw in both cases smooth transition into a much more robust rule of law and all of those attributes that you mentioned. Could it be that there is a very fluid difference between the irreversible bad transitions and reversible bad transitions that you mentioned? Likewise, Argentina and Mexico, particularly Mexico in a slightly different sense, also a generation ago was quite a different Mexico than it is today, and yet it happened pretty much peacefully.
Well, the question is whether my classification is correct.
No,
correct.
whether Korea and Taiwan is sui generis, or is there maybe a different...
Okay, but let me say that I classified 3 cases of bad transition in a given time, at the moment. Yes? And first, those who cannot be reversed in a democratic elections because free elections are impossible. Then something has to happen within the black box of the regime. And this is what has happened in Taiwan. I've studied it. So all of a sudden, there was democratization. But the impulse have to become from dictatorship. It happens, but you cannot take it for granted. Okay? To some extent in South Korea. But in a given moment of time, you have 3 types of regimes which are bad transition. The one which would require a change in the regime so that free elections are possible. The one which has been democratically reversed, and this is a small category on this Macedonia, and the one which is in progress, and we don't know what will be the final result, but the conclusion is act, so that it is democratically reversed. Okay? I don't know whether I'm clear enough.
But I think the question
Yes.
you were asking was whether economic success lays the groundwork for the transition.
Okay. Well, we like to hope that this is the case, perhaps. Let us hope it is. The question is, if yes, how long it would take first. And we are speaking about China. Remember, imagine growing economic complications. What will be the response of a dictator? Economic reforms or aggressive nationalism? And I don't know. But you cannot assume that certainly more economic reform.
But I guess there have been examples of countries that have had very repressive regimes that have been highly successful economically. You know, I'm thinking of Pinochet's Chile would be an example of a country.
But this was not as repressive as anything under socialism, really. It's first. Disregarding all the literature, if you compare Cuba, etc. I am not defending Pinochet. I just want to make a record straight. Secondly, there was a democratic transition, so it was not imposed upon the regime. It was a democratic transition in Chile.
Yeah, but just coming back to Ms. Elkin's question, it seems that one's not necessarily talking in terms of distribution, that you've got to have equality of distribution, but I'm thinking from the United States point of view, where because we had quantitative easing as being the main instrument in which the recovery occurred, we had those who held equities really benefited. Those who didn't hold equities really didn't benefit particularly. So you had great disparity in different classes of society gaining from a recovery, and that, in the United States at least, seemed to have produced incredible political change. So I don't think the question is, do you get equality? I think it's a question if there's a perception that what is going on is unfair, that can produce political results.
I was not commenting on the US. I did not dare, but I can do it. Now, one of the side effects of quantitative easing policy has been this distributional effect. This has been denied by the research by Fed, but I think it's not very convincing. So affecting the distribution to such an extent that some people think they've been disadvantaged may be a real phenomenon, but blame it on unconventional monetary policy. Second point, on the US electoral system. Because as we know, one does not need to have majority, overall majority. It's enough to target certain groups of population, which I understand was done by Trump. And how many thousand votes were enough to tilt the balance towards the victory of Trump?
Well, it's not just a question of Trump, it's a question that somebody like Bernie Sanders on the other side of the spectrum also tapped in to that discontent. I guess that the issue is one's really doesn't need to just look at GDP growth or income growth. One's also got to look at, what was the increase in wealth of...
You mean that you mean increases in inequality which inflame some people? This is what you mean?
Correct.
But in this discussion, let me comment more broadly. I am also struck by the fact that losers are focused on in the US without mentioning the winners in poorer countries. Many more poor Chinese have brought out of poverty because of globalization, free trade. But people in the West, especially economists, just focused on this elite or true losers. Secondly, you have, I think regarding globalization policies, it's useful to distinguish between opening and policies which determine adjustment. Now, if there was opening, but policies which determine adjustment, incentives, and possibilities in some parts of the US, to my understanding, were deteriorating. So people have less incentives to move to more productive jobs and localities because of protection. Increased protection reduces incentives to cope. And I understand that in the US there are some pockets of very bad education, inequality of education. So if so happens, then you have losers which are not only due to opening, but of very bad policies, limiting individuals' adjustment.
I guess there are no more questions, and we're somewhat over the time. So it just remains for me to thank you for a very stimulating discussion.
Thanks a lot. Now I have to disarm.